Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good? Good JNUC so far? Everyone having a good time? Like kind of midway through. Everyone going to the party tonight at Brits? It's pretty epic. I'm sure you've heard from other folks that maybe have attended the conference before. It's a pretty good time. So again, welcome to our session, again, talking about profiles. And when Daniel and I were preparing for the talk today, we were thinking about how to approach this. And the thing with conferences is there typically tends to be a wide variety of folks, everyone from beginner, novice to folks that have been part of the Apple community for decades. So by no means is this all comprehensive. We only have 45 minutes, and I know how much we all love profiles. I'm sure we could talk about it for 3 hours, but we have 45 minutes. So definitely trying to hit key items that Daniel and I thought were important to the topic. But as John mentioned, feel free to use Twitter to ask questions, and also be posting the slides as well to my blog. We'll talk about that later on as well. Or feel free to hit Dan and I after the presentation to talk further as well. So we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. So since I have the mic, I guess I'll go first. My name is Terry Grossheim. I'm a systems engineer with Jamf Software. I've been with the company for about 1.5 years now. I work with K-20 institutions. I'm based out of Chicago. Work with folks in Canada and the US. I have a extensive background with Apple technologies. I've been tinkering with Mac since the 90s. I've worked for Apple corporate resellers, and I've worked in IT. And before that, I had a background, and it was quite a good time working in the professional audio industry. And I'll let Daniel go ahead and introduce himself.
Hey, so as it says up there, my name's Daniel Mintz. I am a professional services engineer with Jamf. I'm based out of London. I've been with the company just under 3 years. Our team, what do professional services do? Well, we meet you guys at your site. We're doing jump starts. We're doing expanded services, custom engagements, helping you take the product beyond the jump start and get some real value out of it. Prior to joining Jamf, I was a systems engineer with another service provider who's a partner of ours. And prior to that, I was in Apple hardware repairs. So back in the day of eMacs and PowerMac G5s. But there's only so many processors and RAM chips you can change out before it gets a little bit tough. And yeah, so back to Terry for introduction.
Thank you. So just a brief rundown of our agenda. I can talk a little bit about history, which was a good time. I think Dan and I were cracking jokes, kind of reminiscing about management technologies when we're preparing for this. So looking forward to chatting about that. Talk a little bit about management settings in macOS Sierra. And then, of course, the 2 topics of the hour, configuration and provisioning profiles. That's really going to take up the majority of the talk today. And then whatever time remaining that we do have, we'll take a Q&A. So with that, back to Dan.
Got the clicker as well. Oh, you started it already for me. There you go. Oh, she spoiled the build-up of it now, so there you go. So, conscious of the fact that we're the last session of the day, a history and timeline of management, we could go on for quite a while. So to prevent you from being here till 6 p.m., we're going to kind of speed things up and move things along. So starting sort of 2001 time, we've got this beast of a machine here. Is it a Quicksilver Mac Pro, I think? Or it's not the Mirador, it's definitely the Quicksilver. So, powerful machine for 2001. And a lot of the preferences we're going to be setting are going to be done using a script. Do we want, in this example here, we're going to be setting the screensaver so that it asks for a password. And to be honest, you're going to have to run a command to get it to run. If you ever want to modify it or change anything, it's another script. And then if you wanted to take it a step further, you'd probably be looking to disable the system preferences pane so that someone can't go back in and change it. Well, at least can't change it easily. So then you probably want to be modifying the permissions on the system preference pane. So lots of individual commands, no hard and fast way of changing things. Jumping forward slightly into 2002, and 10.2, we've got Jaguar launches. And with Jaguar, Income sort of brings along Jaguar Server. And then we see the first iteration of Workgroup Manager, and MCX comes along. So, we've gone from script, which, let's face it, you can still use the defaults write command now. It's not gone. It's just that you'd be looking now with 10.2 server to be using MCX in conjunction with Workgroup Manager. And Terry's going to give an overview of the MCX technology that was after this. So things kind of stick like this. We've got 10.3, 10.4, 10.5, and even 10.6 where MCX is still being used. And then 2007, and this guy comes along, the first iPhone. And, very popular. And suddenly people are saying, well, how can I configure this? How can I get this working in my environment and safe to use in our business? And configuration profiles land. Typically done using iPhone configuration utility, which obviously is not around anymore, but you've got something like Apple Configurator, which may or may not be used if you're using DEP. So that's there. And then we jump forward slightly to 2011, and 10.7 comes along. Now 10.7 is the first version of the OS where there is no dedicated server build. You've got the server app. You can still download Workgroup Manager, so you could, in theory, still go with your MCX or the Golden Triangle or whatever you want to call it, but Profile Manager comes along in the server app. So we're starting to bring profiles forward. And then that kind of stays that way, and things are still with Profile Manager or the JSS, but we're in 2016, we've got Sierra, and Jamf Pro, not JSS, we've got Jamf Pro version 9.96. I'm going to add a disclaimer that I may say JSS many times. We were going to try and get you to tweet a guess as to how many times we'd say JSS, and then the winner would get a drink at the party tonight, but I thought it could get quite expensive. So anyone want to take a guess, please feel free to tweet, but there is no prize, there's no free drink.
I do say JSS in the presentation.
Cool. So back over to you.
Sounds good. So does anyone remember this, or?
Anyone still using?
So much excitement about it. I feel like you guys miss it. No? No. Right, manage preferences, or MCX, right? Policy-based management. And of course, the golden triangle, binding to both Active Directory and Open Directory, right? You get the authentication through Active Directory, but then policies and preferences are being passed down from Open Directory and being applied to a machine. So, and this was a 2002, what was the? 2002 to 2007, yes. And this is kind of where we left things off. I definitely did this as well when I was an IT manager. Begrudgingly, I was really happy that when I didn't have to do this anymore and when it went away. But honestly, when I do, in my role, I sometimes do evaluations. There are some applications for this depending on what folks are trying to do. And every time I go down that path because I want to help customers, I'm always like, is there a way a profile can do this for you? Because there's just some times where this is not consistent when we're talking about managed preferences with Jamf Pro. And then we have Workgroup Manager. Anyone miss Workgroup Manager? Anyone? How many people use Workgroup Manager in this room? Raise your hand. Or do you still use it? How many people still use it? Yeah, we have a few. Yeah. See? Nothing wrong with that. Right? This is directory-based MCX, right? You can take your group of users and then apply preferences or policies, things like a doc setting. What else do we have up here? System preferences, and things like that, right? So people are still using it, but it sounds like used is the consensus in the room. And that's pretty much where Apple is going, right? This is becoming more antiquated, where obviously some of the current technologies are being ramped up, things like profiles and DEP and all those kinds of things. But when we're looking back at this, once Leopard appeared, we had local MCX also at that time, meaning we could have preferences sit locally on the machine instead of being reinforced from the directory. So that also happened as well, kind of in this era. So I can give a shout out to that. Fast forwarding to today, I'm going to kind of kick things off with things that are new in macOS Sierra. Some new payloads, right? You're able to configure firewall settings on the Mac. And I wasn't very excited about this when I was putting this together, but I'm like, oh, I should probably include it because it's new. But you can actually allow or enable or disable LinkedIn configurations as well in internet accounts. And then you do have some new restrictions. Has anyone used the new Apple Watch to unlock Mac at all? Yeah, we have a few. I think that's kind of cool, but you can actually enable and disable that as well as far as restrictions are concerned. And then there's some settings with iCloud that you can work with, things like notes and reminders, as well as iCloud keychain sync, and then the Back to My Mac functionality, which allows you via iCloud to set up a network of Macs that you can remote into as well. So you do have some new things in macOS Sierra that you can play with. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan to go more into configuration profiles.
Thank you. So configuration profiles, probably the biggest bulk of the presentation. The thing to do to be applying settings. Now, before we get going, I want to get the fancy transition from Keynote out of my system. I promise you there's only one. It's amazing, yeah? I mean, it's brilliant stuff. So the reason we've got this on, less is more. So it reminds me that, there's a little story coming here. So my first ever jumpstart, used Casper with the company I was with, but never really gone out to do a jumpstart on my own. So I turn up to a school, and there's this IT admin there. Beige shirt, tie with a picture of a PC on it. And we've got the whole thing, keychain with the keys on there. And he's moving from the golden triangle to Casper. And he's had all his budget taken, and he's got 30 brand new iMacs, and he wants to manage them. So I'm trying to go through smart groups and the whole thing. He says, I don't care. I just want you to lock these down, and I want you to make them look like PCs. I'm like, okay. You can imagine the scenario at the moment. I'm thinking, where is this going? So he gives me a USB drive, and on there is a picture of the Windows desktop, the little hills, and this is XP at the time. So he's like, I want you to put that on. Fine, challenge accepted, we can do this, it's easy. He's like, I don't want a dock. I'm like, really? That's kind of the whole experience, I want you to put a link, like the start menu in the bottom corner. So anyway, it goes on and on and on from here, and I tell him, you just can't do this, this is not the experience. But the reason I'm telling you this is that sure, you're going to have security policies mandated down. You have to make sure that there's a password after screensaver and various different settings, password complexity. That's great. Apply all those settings. But then after that, the restrictions, setting the wallpaper, all this, we want to make sure that the Mac experience stays. And if you've got local user accounts there, people can change things. And if we need to, let's apply loads of restrictions. But if not, the way I sort of approach new jump starts is to say, look, less is more. That users can change the size of their dock. Unless there's a valid reason, try and avoid it. Just let people be free with what they want to do on the machine. Oh, and it shakes as well. And it's gone. So, configuration profiles. What are they? So I just got some presenter notes here. So let's just swap. Sure. The memory's still there, but let's get a few things. So what are they? Well, simply put, they're text files. We're distributing configuration information. And specifically, they're plist. If we look at the contents of this thing here, it's a plist, and it's in XML format. So the anatomy of a profile. Well, we've got lots, and to be fair, you're going to struggle to see a lot of this on here because there's small text on there. So don't worry, we will have the slides available. But in general, there's loads and loads of lines of text, but we're looking at keys and values, like if you were to go through a plist and see what's been set. So this particular one is a profile for managing the dock. We could have at the time used this to get rid of the dock if we wanted to, or at least hide it. But we're just going to go ahead and highlight out a few key things on here, which you really can't see, so I do apologize. We're keeping it, this is not fancy. So we've got things on here like organization name, we've got things on here like the domain that we're going with, so com.apple.doc. And there are settings in here. Now, we're just going to advance through these because I can see a few people thinking, I just can't see this on the screen. So, let's get past this. But in general, when we pull that to the side and put it next to the actual system preference pane, what we aim to do was show you that there are different, where we see the settings in the plist. So we can see here the size of the dock. We can see whether it's turned on to hide, I believe, in it. And then we can see all the different organization settings, the name of the profile. So it's really just kind of understanding where things are. So the other thing is hopefully you can see here, is what's happening in the background. So this was taken from system information. So this was actually one that's on my machine. The policy at Jamf, we have to have file vault turned on. So what you can see here is that it's actually com.apple.mcx.filevault. So even though this is a config profile, the MCXs do still live and sit on the machine. And in this particular one, we're basically using the profile to configure that MCX. Now, some of the profiles will do that, some of them don't. If you're deploying down a certificate, for example, it's going to be using the security command to install that certificate for you. So onto something we can all read now. So how can they be made? How can we install them? So Profile Manager. Now, obviously, you're at a Jamf event, and we are going to talk about Jamf Pro, but we have to recognize that there are different ways of making them. And this is by no means me telling you, go out and get a Mac Mini and put it in your server cabinets. We're not telling you to have those. If you've got a Mac Mini on site already, brilliant. So Profile Manager, why would we be using it? Well, we could be using it for testing. There are some times where a payload will come down from Jamf Pro, and actually it won't quite give you the experience you're after. So the best way to sort of start is to take Profile Manager and do exactly the same profile. Download it, run it, do we get the same experience? And then the other thing, sometimes the custom settings payload, for example, much, much easier to use and more intuitive in Profile Manager. So actually what I have on my machine is I have a VM of macOS. And then I just, if I need it, I can launch it, use Profile Manager, kill it down after that. And the reason I say it's intuitive is that you can actually add different values. So you could add different keys and different values in the profile, and it's a lot easier to configure. So we've made a profile in Profile Manager. And again, the text is a little bit difficult to read, so I apologize again. But it's one long line of text, and you're thinking, why is he showing me this? It's impossible to read. It's somewhere off there. And the reason is the formatting. Profile Manager will download them without any line breaks. So just adding a command in there, we can then get it back to readable. And it's a lot better and a lot easier to use. Now, this particular profile was actually something that, that profile was something to do with Office. So we were actually using a custom payload there. Now, I've jumped back to having the two instances there. We've got a Jamf Pro and we've got Profile Manager. The majority of the payloads are exactly the same. There are, again, some subtle differences in the way they're presented on screen, but the payloads do give the same outcome. But we can see here the custom one in the JSS. And I presume you've all seen this one before. There's an upload box, and you can also then add in a domain there if you want to. But obviously in Profile Manager, there are slightly more options. And again, what we've done with the custom payload here was we took a plist and we uploaded it. And the outcome is that we want a profile. Because this was from a customer who wanted to be setting the user experience for Outlook. So when you launched it for the first time, there was no the setup assistant. So I did that, and we got the profile out again. And again, we're highlighting here, that's where the values are, and we could package it up, or we could put it back up to the JSS. Now, whilst we're talking about custom payloads and taking plists, it's worth us mentioning this brilliant tool by a very smart guy called Tim Sutton, MCX to Profile, and you can download it off GitHub. This is just another way, if you're using MCXs still, or you want to transfer any to profiles, then this is kind of not platform specific. You can run it without having a JSS. And it's just going to allow you to take a plist, run in this case, a Python script, and it's going to give you a profile. So, how can we deploy these things? Now, obviously, there is by MDM using Apple Push, and we've got the Jamf Pro. Nearly said JSS there. We could just take a profile and double-click on it. We can just run it. But again, it's not really very smart. We're not going to get our users to go and download a profile and double-click on it. Or we could be using a command line or an SSH session or a script to use the profiles command to install them. And again, there's going to be varying different reasons why you do one or the other. And then there are two others, because there are 5 in total if you were to look at the documentation by Apple. But I'm not going to tell anyone how to send an email. This is not what the session was designed for. And I'm not going to tell anyone how to browse to a website and click download on a profile, because you can host the profiles online and get users to download them. So the JSS. Is there anyone in here who hasn't distributed a config profile with a JSS? No? Cool. So again, we're not going to talk about making them, but we are going to sort of discuss the advantages of why you would be wanting to do this. Well, obviously, you've all paid for the product, and therefore you have the functionality. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you've got some brilliant scoping here. You've got the chance to scope to groups of machines or to single machines or exclude people. You could even start using iBeacons if you wanted to. So there's lots of options there. And it is in the JSS that you can't see the download button, so you can get the profile. Now, there are times where APNS is not an option. We've been to do jump starts where change management hasn't cleared and we haven't been able to get the ports open, and therefore it's just not worked. You can't do it without that. You can't use MDM. So in that instance, that's where the download button comes in and where the next few things that we talk about are going to really come into play. So this is what it looks like. You download the profile, you click install, very simple. Great for testing, or again, on a jump start if we just wanted to show somebody exactly what was going on. But this, I think, is probably the most useful thing to do if you can't push the profiles by MDM. So obviously there we've got the command and the location of it. Now, there are many different options on here. So we've got -I for installing and -F, obviously, if you're going to be going from file. We've got P for server. If you want to delete all your profiles, if you're feeling brave, maybe you're going to run away from the office and you're going to issue that command to every single machine just to clear the whole lot off. Yeah, that's it. Just jump through the window after sending out a mass command through Casper remote. Yeah. But having said that, if you were migrating from another management platform and you needed to clear off all the profiles, you could use the -D, -R if we were looking to remove a specific profile, and -S, which would allow, it would put the profile down but wouldn't actually install it until the next boot. Now, the example that I'm using this in is the most common way that we're going to be delivering those profiles without APNS. We're using a policy. So we have to package the profile up and get it out to the machine. So in Composer, we're adding this in. And then before we build out the package, we're going to add a post-install script. And all we've done is we've added the -I and -F because the profile gets deployed down to, in this case, the temp directory, and then from there it will install it. So I guess one of the final pieces with the profiles in this puzzle is what are we putting into them? We can talk about building them and deploying them, but what goes into the specific profiles? Now, as the pictures will suggest, we've got two types of payload. We've got a user and we've got a machine-based one. And you have to really consider which one you're going to put down, what the use case is. Because to be honest, a lot of the time, the profile payloads are kind of similar. If you've looked at the user-based ones, there are different elements of them, like email or LDAP, that are specific to users. but you could quite easily apply a restriction by user or by computer level. So it's what makes the best choice. If we're configuring a lab of machines and we want all 35 machines in that environment to have the same doc, no matter who logs in, then we're going to go ahead and choose a computer level. If we want to have, say, 6 kiosk machines in a university library, and we're going to be looking to have specific students getting different wallpapers on the machine or different dock configurations, then we'd be looking for a user-based one, because we'd be scoping it to all machines, but only then adding a limitation to a specific group. And with the profiles and the payloads comes a best practice, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, is that you want to try and avoid having one profile with multiple payloads. There are instances where a specific payload will call for having more than one option in there, but on the whole, you want to try and avoid it. And I guess the reason is that if you've got all these different payloads in there and you want to just update something, something slight, maybe you've got a profile with email, Wi-Fi, and I've seen this done. We've seen instances where there's been super profile that's had like 10 payloads in there. If you had an email payload in there and, say, a login window, and you just need to change the spelling, or you had a typo on that message, if you update it, it doesn't just, the minute you hit save or done, it doesn't just go ahead and add the little modification. It actually removes the whole payload. Meaning, if you've got email there, you could empty someone's inbox, and if there were 200 or 300 machines, you could then start the download and cache of the 300 inboxes, meaning that you're A, going to cripple the network, B, you might end up adding some business continuity concerns there, because people have lost all their emails. God forbid, it could have been, not that I think it's possible to have pop email still, Imagine if you lost all those emails, but seldom, it's never, I don't even think it's an option on the payload, or at least not in the most recent version. So that's the best practice, and obviously we're going to talk about combining different payloads to sort of achieve a task. Now, computer level, as I said, they're affecting the whole machine. It makes no difference. They're not picky about which user. It's just going to go down. So if we're going to be adding restrictions, whoever logs in gets the restrictions. It's constant management, and they're scoped to machines or groups of machines. And they're pretty flexible, because you can limit them to network segments or iBeacons. You can exclude machines or groups of machines or buildings or departments. So there's pretty much all the options there. And there's a brilliant reference page that has every single payload with all the details. And we're going to have the link up on here, and again, you'll be able to grab it on the slide deck. Now, again, to avoid keeping you here any longer than we need to, we're not going to go through each payload, because we could be here for quite some time. But we are going to go through what I would say are some of the more key ones. So everyone, or most presentations that are talking about managing OS 10 devices, that the big topic comes up: to bind or not to bind. And that's such a key thing that, for example, the passcode payload, that comes into play, because you're not binding to a directory, therefore you don't have the policy from AD. You might then end up wanting to have a passcode policy that restricts that not restricts, but says it has to be a certain length, or alphanumeric, or an expiration date. So again, this is a payload where you'd be doing that. And then we've got network. So this is a big one if you're going to be doing 8021X, or you're going to be doing Wi-Fi payloads or Ethernet payloads. This is where you're going to be adding that information. And again, this is where we're getting to the point of having combined payloads in here. So certificates. You might have certificates on their own, and you might have 6 or 7 different certificates in one profile. It's perfectly cool. And you might have SCEP. So you're not binding your machines to the domain, but you want to request a machine certificate. So you're going to probably use the SCEP payload. And that's one where you would want to have the SCEP payload in the same profile as the network. So if you were sending down the Wi-Fi, you need to have the same machine certificate in there. Restrictions, Terry mentioned the things like LinkedIn or in this case, turning off the camera, or restricting system preference access, even restricting the App Store down to just updates. That's going to come in with the restrictions payload. Oh, where have we gone? There you go. And security and, oh God. I'm not even going to pretend to read it. My eyesight's gone there, but we've got the security and privacy. There we go. So we've got things like the firewall, we've got things like Gatekeeper, and we've got File Vault. So if you're going to be applying File Vault by config profile, this is the one you're going to want to add. And again, you'll be coupling it up with the File Vault key redirection that's going in there. Again, if you're already applying File Vault by policy, by no means is this us telling you that you're doing it wrong and you should be doing it with profile. There are 10 different ways to achieve the same option. This is just there. It's such a prominent payload, and there are so many blog posts out there about it that I thought it's worth mentioning. AD certificates, so in the instance that you are binding your machines to the directory and you want to be requesting machine or user certificates, this is the payload you're going to use. It's going to get your machine to go off and make a request against a Microsoft certificate service. Proxies, that's a pretty new payload. So how many of you are configuring global proxies on your machines by way of script? One? There we go, a few more. How many of you are adding the proxies into the base image if you're still using a custom base image? There you go, one hand. Cool. But now, in the most recent versions of the Jamf Pro, you can add global proxy payloads into a config profile, meaning that it's very interchangeable and it's easy if you want to be configuring a device for DEP. Okay. Cool. Filed it on, it's on Jamf Nation, yeah? Cool. Brilliant. Correct thing to do. And again, File Vault key redirection can be applied on its own, can be applied with the File Vault payload. Maybe you've got machines out there that haven't been managed yet, but have got an existing File Vault on there, and we just want to redirect the key. So we could put the payload down on its own and then use a policy to reissue an individual File Vault key. And providing that that payload is down prior to the key being issued, then it'll all redirect to the JSS. User level, again, I'm not going to go through all the payloads, but you can see up there that they do differ. There are many that are the same, but there are also some that are very specific to users. And the idea with a user level profile is that we're scoping it to a group of machines, but then limiting and excluding LDAP groups. So obviously you have to have LDAP linked into your JSS. And also these user-based ones will want to be scoping to Active Directory machines. Sometimes they're not going to work. Now, I did want to draw your attention to the variables that can be applied. Now, if your machines are enrolled by DEP, or you've already had a workflow that's been assigning users to the machines, then you're going to have usernames, full names, email addresses linked to those machines. So if you were going to be applying an Exchange or Mail or LDAP or anything like that, you could go ahead and replace, in this instance, username and email. You could just go ahead and replace that with $username or $email, and when it pushes the profile from the JSS, it will replace those values with whatever is linked to the machine. And there are loads and loads of other variables that you can use. They are in the Casper admin guide. I think it's page 349. And is someone going to check it and call me on it now? I'm pretty sure, 349, 350, something like that. Omissions that as we increase the feature set, it may jump slightly. But there are things like $MAC address, $serial number. So there's things to play around with there, but you can push those down. And it's a great use of the username and email here. So here we have the configuration profile reference. This is a great page. It will tell you everything and anything about configuration profiles. And then one more thing to mention would be payload interaction. So I guess you've wondered, how many of these payloads are we putting in? Are they going to conflict? Are they going to cause problems? So the easiest way to think about it, and you'll see this on here, is you've got common payloads and exclusive payloads. So example of a common payload would be a certificate. You could be putting down 6 or 7 certificates and it won't have any impact. Either of them won't cause a problem. But if you were to take, for example, an exclusive payload like the proxy, you can only have one value configured for a global proxy on there. So you wouldn't have a profile with 2 payloads the same like that. But again, there are so many bits of information there that I could keep you here another hour going through the whole thing. So we'll let you just browse it at your leisure. And that's configuration profiles. Again, any questions, just drop them in on the Twitter, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. But over to Terry for provisioning profiles.
Thanks, Dan. So provisioning profiles. When I was preparing for the session today, it just really made me think about the changes that I've seen over the years. Not even the changes, but the app ecosystem that Apple has issued and how kind of cool it is, right? I'm sure it's interesting to debate. You know, a lot of folks in the media like to be negative about it, especially, you know, talking about how Apple creates jobs for people, or if they're doing things overseas, or building, hardware, for instance, not in the US. And I always think about the App Store ecosystem and how much money that generates for folks. And not only that, but how other competitors have basically emulated very similar ecosystems. But I feel, you know, the way that Apple's implemented it, it's actually pretty profound what's taken off over the years. And now, especially with you know, the proliferation of apps and you know, you probably see a lot of things in the media as far as like app-driven economy, and just how that's really taken off over the years. But of course, provisioning profiles, this is where you're going to want to pay attention if you're distributing in-house or B2B apps in your org. Provisioning profiles are how you're going to be able to achieve that, whether you're an education customer. Apple's come out with some really cool stuff for students right now, as far as coding programs are concerned. So there's some really cool things you can do there if you're working in education to help enable teachers and instructional technologists if they want to leverage that. And you can also, you know, use Jamf Pro in order to distribute those apps. Or obviously, if you're working in a business or enterprise environment and you are working with in-house or B2B apps, whether that's internally or with contractors, you're going to want to pay attention to provisioning profiles, right? So in order for an in-house app to work on a device, a provisioning profile must be installed on it in order for it to run. Where do you get a provisioning profile? Does anyone know where you get a provisioning profile from? No? Apple Configurator? Did you get? Was that a guess or a?
Sounded right.
what was your guess? Yep, the developer program. That's right. Yep. So basically, you can download it from a developer account. So as long as you belong to a program, you're able to download that provisioning profile. And I'm going to talk about the ways that you can work with provisioning profiles in deploying in-house apps. And as I mentioned, that profile does need to be installed on the device in order for the app to launch or run. If the information in that provisioning profile doesn't meet certain criteria, the app won't launch. So basically, instead of, as a normal developer, right, if you were going to submit an app to the App Store for, for consumption, Apple goes through that kind of checks and balances. I'll say checks. I don't know what the official term would be, right? But they check, go through the app, make sure that it's secure, it's functioning properly, the end user's having the great experience, and if it's not going that route, Apple kicks it back to you. So what that provisioning profile is doing is ensuring that that process is happening without Apple doing it, okay? You're gonna have a few different options in Xcode, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second as far as how you work with provisioning profiles in order to deploy an in-house or a B2B app. So as far as provisioning profiles and a Jamf Pro, what can you do, right? What can you do with, and here I have the JSS up here, so I guess I owe everyone in the room a drink. I don't know if I have that much money. But what are the functions that you can work with provisioning profiles? So you can upload edit or delete or download those profiles, right? Those are the actions that you can do with a provisioning profile. You must upload a provisioning profile in order to deploy an in-house app with Jamf Pro, so just make note of that as well. And how do you prepare an in-house app for wireless distribution? How does that happen, okay? And basically what you're gonna need to do is build an IPA file, or what we like to call an archive version of the app. And then that's where Xcode comes into play, which is what you mentioned, right? You basically create Xcode to create the app archive. You want to sign the app using one of two kinds of certificates, depending on what you're trying to achieve. And then obviously you need the provisioning profile that we've been talking about. Xcode uses your signing identity to sign the app during the build process. So that's where the security mechanism comes into place. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you're going to want a distribution certificate or a development certificate, or you might want both, right? Depending on what you're doing. So with a development certificate, it identifies you. And if depending on how much you know about the developer program, they have different, I want to say, roles within the program. So what they have a team member, which is basically somebody who has access as a developer to the program to just basically, I'll say, do development, right? But basically what that does is allows the development profile to launch on the device, right? That's the basic functionality for that app to run on a device. If you're interested in a B2B app, like via iTunes Connect, that's where a distribution a distribution certificate is going to come into play. So that distribution certificate identifies your team or org in the provisioning profile in order for you to distribute that app via something like iTunes Connect. So what's some of the code behind that? I thought one of the most important thing to talk about, and again, we only had 45 minutes, but just I wanted to call it the app ID. I felt that this was kind of the most important piece behind what's happening here. But what is an app ID? It's a two-part string used to identify one or more apps for a single development team, right? So the team ID is generated by Apple, which is the first part, and then the second part, it's separated by a period. And that's where the bundle ID search string comes into play, and that's something that you create. And what that does is it matches either the bundle ID of a single app or a set of bundle IDs for a group of apps. And if you've ever played with the JSS or Jamf Pro, and you're looking at that, and you've tried to deploy an in-house app, there's a little field for a bundle ID. So that's where that code is matching what you're deploying within Jamf Pro, or the JSS. So again, you have two options when it comes to the app ID. You can either choose to use an explicit app ID or a wildcard app ID. And you might think, okay, what's the difference? And really what the difference is if you're using an app service, I guess what Apple calls an app service. So if you're deploying an in-house app that uses something like iCloud or in-app purchasing, for instance, a service, and this is all in the developer account, so you can read it as well. I have the URL here. That's where you want to use an explicit app ID. If you're not using those services, it seems like a wildcard app ID is going to work out for you. So when you're going through the portal, it looks a little bit like this. You register the app ID. And then you can go ahead and create your explicit app ID or wildcard ID, depending on what you're going for. With the explicit app ID, this is where you go through and check which services that you want, so you can kind of see what's available to you. I mentioned a few earlier. And then if you're looking to either test, or if you want to do like a pre-release to any contractors, maybe any teachers or instructional technologists that you want to maybe test or work with the app to see if it's going to work for them. Those are all things that you can do with the devices, but you can register up to 100 devices in order for that to function in a sort of a test environment. This is the way I looked at it. So as far as in-house app distribution, there's just some items that I wanted to call out. So you can consider where the app is hosted. There are 3 areas where you can host an in-house app for distribution, given what you're going for. So things like distribution points, the Jamf software database, or the web server. And then we do have some requirements listed up here as well, things like the bundle identifier, If you're going to do it via a web server, you obviously need the URL and the IPA file. Or if you do a provisioning profile and the archive app file, you can also do it that way if you want to just deploy it as like a regular app. So given that we have a few minutes left, I'm going to just breeze through some of these slides. And the distribution of an in-house app via Jamf Pro, very similar to the normal experience of deploying apps. You go through the GUI and go under mobile devices, mobile device apps. This pane, obviously, you do things like bundle ID and general info. You can see I have hosting location called out at the bottom there as well. So that's where you can actually toggle and choose where the app is being deployed from. And then Dan obviously went through scoping quite a bit with configuration profiles. I'm assuming that everybody's deployed apps with Jamf Pro in here. If not, we can definitely talk more in depth as well on that, but given the time that we have, I'm not going to go into detail. But here, obviously, you can configure as your heart's desire and go also via self-service or app configuration. We do support app configuration with in-house apps as well, so you're able to do that. Go ahead and click Save, and it's just like a normal experience of deploying an app with Jamf Pro. So with that, thanks for coming. Before we take any questions, this is my Twitter handle. I'm gonna post the slides to my blog, and my link to my blog is in my Twitter profile. So if you're interested in getting a copy of these slides, feel free to. The slides aren't there yet. I'll do it after the presentation, but feel free just to go there, click on the link on my profile, and go to my blog, and it'll be the top post on there. I'll try to make it easy to find, but it's just called Profiles in Depth as far as the session is concerned. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Terry and Dan. I apologize in advance because there were quite a few questions that have come in, but we are slightly over time, so I'm just going to go through two that I think come up quite frequently. The first one was, is there any way to delay or assign a take effect date or time to a configuration profile? For example, with profiles deploying during school time.
So on that one, at the moment, there is no way to be timing the delivery of a profile. If you really wanted to do that, I would say go down the route of deploying them by policy, because obviously with the policy, you can add when it does run, when it doesn't, the time, and things like that. So yeah, it could be a feature request. If it's not, get on Jamf Nation and make it.
And the reason I asked that one is because I have seen some schools do that with iBeacons. So when you go to school, it applies. When you leave school, it unapplies. So something to consider, perhaps. The other one I wanted to ask, because again, it's something I hear quite frequently, is there a way to require LDAP authentication during pre-stage enrollment to stop sensitive profiles from installing on DEP computers?
Is there a way to restrict LDAP?
So I guess to rephrase it, can we make users authenticate with LDAP credentials during DEP to make sure that only the right profiles are going to the right people?
Yeah, through account, yeah. So account, yeah, there's an account, there's an account settings payload in the pre-stage enrollment panel for DEP, and you just enforce that. But I know that there have been some issues with that. I've been working with some customers, so I don't know what the status of that is, but that would be the way that I would approach it. Did you have another way? Yeah. On the Mac, or on what platform?
Cool, thank you very much.
Okay.
That is time, I'm afraid, guys. I hope you've had a good time. I hope you all have a good time at the party tonight. And again, big round of applause for Dan and Terry. Thank you.